I lived next door to old Man Werther for the first 7 years of my life, but I only ever saw him twice. No one in the neighborhood knew much about him or ever saw him leave his house, which stood dark and silent year-round. His back garden was always a mess, with dying flowers and brown scratchy shrubs growing out of control. But the grass and the bushes never became quite so badly overgrown that you knew it was entirely neglected. My dad used to joke that Mr. Werther must tend to his garden in the dead of night. My best friend, N, lived next door but one with old Man Werther in between. N was mad about football, and all we ever seemed to do after school was boot the ball around one of our backyards. And of course, every 5 minutes the ball would be faced over the fence into our reclusive neighbor's property. We'd learned that knocking on the door was no use, so whoever kicked it had to clamber over the fence and retrieve it themselves. I dreaded going and rooting through the tall bushes for the ball. Sometimes I thought I saw the curtains twitch in the gloom. N was always bolder than I was, and he teased me, as he knew I was afraid. Hanging over the fence watching, he'd shout that old Man Werther was looking out of an upstairs window, then a downstairs window, then he was opening his back door. I wasn't quite gullible enough to believe him, but still couldn't breathe until I had chucked the ball back and flung myself to safety. N wasn't a bad kid, he was just cocky and a piss-taker. When it was his turn to fetch the football, he'd pee in a bush, stomp on as many decaying flowers as he could, and creep right up to those black windows to peek inside. He'd tell me that he saw a curtain snap shut, but I always thought he was just winding me up. A thin kitchen window was always open a crack, and he suggested that we try to open it further and climb inside to see if the old man had secretly croaked years ago, as widely assumed. One afternoon, after school, I was aimlessly kicking the ball about, alone, as N hadn't called around even though he said he would. Inevitably, the ball soon went over. In horror, I watched it bounce against a knackered old oak tree and sail straight and down into old Man Werther's house, much closer than I'd ever been before. My heart still, it took an eternity to creep along through the yellowed grass before finally lifting the ball and feeling like Indiana Jones when he held aloft that little golden statue. Emboldened, I was compelled to have a quick look through the nearest window. Nothing but just a pure black hole with tattered brown curtains on each side. I was about to turn and stride away when I saw movement. A face appeared. It was my friend N. He was only there for a second, his face bright red. He looked me in the eyes through a flood of tears. I couldn't hear him through the dirty glass, but it looked like he was screaming, his little lungs out. Then an arm so thin and pale looked like a bone hooked end beneath his chin, and he vanished. The curtains were thrust shut. 3 seconds later, I was hammering at my back door to be let in. My mom thought I was messing about at first. Then she suggested I had imagined things. She knew I was scared of our strange neighbor, but she soon began to take me seriously. I phoned N's mother, who was awfully surprised as N hadn't returned from school, so she'd assumed he had gone straight to my house. The police were called, several officers visited old Man Werther, while a nice young officer spoke to me for what seemed about 4 hours, but no trace of N was ever found, despite 2 further searches over the next few days. The same young officer returned a week later and told me that Mr. Werther was not a suspect, and that maybe my mind had been playing tricks. She pointed out that Mr. Werther was in his late 80s and had never been in any kind of trouble before, but she seemed troubled and unsure of her own words. Something came to light during the investigation that surprised the whole neighborhood. Old Man Werther earned his living as a rather brilliant child's illustrator. The police had found literally thousands of small sketches all over his walls. He worked with the prolific author for years, churning about 4 or 5 children's novels a year. I wasn't a big reader, but I knew I'd spotted one of their books in our school library, so I didn't waste any time the next day. I couldn't wait to have a look. I soon wish I hadn't, though. It was a cheesy novel featuring a group of kids around my age who solved a burglary or something. There were 15 or 16 illustrations breaking up the text. One picture was of 3 boys playing football in a suburban backyard, and they didn't half resemble me and another lad we knew. Even their clothes were similar. Hands trembling, I flicked through the book. There I was again, along with more kids who all seemed to closely resemble the ones who lived near me. One picture showed N creeping through an overgrown garden to peer through a dark window. I shoved the book in my mom's face and blabbered about the spooky similarities. But it was a drained and listless face. My mom had changed a great deal over that long week. N's mom was a good friend, and N himself had that rambunctious cheekiness that all moms seemed to love. The neighborhood had changed forever, and only stayed there for another week or so before finding a new house and moving across the town. She assured me that any resemblance was a coincidence, and it was all in my little mind. I spent those last weeks in that old house terrified at the thought of Mr. Old Man Werther appearing from his upstairs windows, from where he had a clear view of 9 or 10 local backyards and maybe 20 local children. I didn't like to play football there anymore. I cycled back to the old street once or twice over the years, figuring that Old Man Werther must have died already by then. I think I was seeking confirmation of some sort, but each time I returned, the one house stood out in the otherwise bright and lively road, with its dead plants and dark windows. He'd be over 100 now, but perhaps he's still there. I don't know. The last time I ever went back, I saw the young family who had moved into our old house. Their 5 kids, aged about 3 to 10, were screaming with delight as they kicked a football around. The second time I saw Old Man Werther was a few days before we moved away. I had become a very troubled young man, and my fitful sleep was filled with torments, waking in a familiar panic at around midnight. I sat up in bed and peered out a window over the backyard. Under the bright full moon, I saw a figure next door. He was just skin and bone, but very tall, bald on top with long, tangled silver hair down to his slender shoulders. He had a terrible overbite, and several jagged teeth pointed down his lower jaw. His nose was crooked as if once broken. His white chest was bare. He only wore heavy, ancient green overalls. The nails on his fingers and toes were a good 2 inches long. I couldn't see his eyes behind gigantic goggles like a World War II pilot might have worn, or maybe a welder. Moonlight glinted in each lens, as big as a beer mat. In his hand was a rusted watering can, but what sprinkled onto the plants didn't look like water. It was thick and black, and it looked like blood. Hey everybody, Ark here. I hope you enjoyed this video. This is one of my more favorite stories I've read so far, I think. I'm always on the lookout for stories, so if you have a good story in mind, or better yet, a personal experience of your own, please email me at the email in the description. Thank you all so much for watching, and if you enjoy these type of videos, don't forget to subscribe.